Let me just start just by way of background, then I'll show a video. I've been reporting on and analyzing the boycott, the BDS movement since 2006. So that 1 year after the BDS movement formally declared its goal to isolate Israel and punish its economy. But I should add, before BDS was formally announced in 2005, Europe has been infected with BDS. So BDS has existed in Europe for decades. I would argue, going back to 1967, after the war, BDS, at least it wasn't called that, but it existed nominally and on the ground, and BDS accelerated after 1967. So I'll use the phrase BDS to capture what took place in Europe since 2005 and since 1967. Well, let me just start with this video. I'm extremely technologically inept, so I hope I can do this. This is, okay, they have the code pink. This is at APEC 2015 code pink demonstrators. You can't hear it? Can we turn up the volume?
We get the message. It's all right.
You get the message, okay. So let's see if we can. Netanyahu, you will see. So they were equating Hitler with Bibi Netanyahu. I wonder if we can shut this this off here so that we get rid of the blue light. So yeah, you folks got the gist of the Code Pink demonstration in front of the APEC Policy Conference in 2015. I assume here everyone knows who Code Pink is. It's a crackpot, extreme leftist group that supports BDS. And on its website, it has a number of pages calling for Israel to be boycotted. Here, as you can see, the one of the co-founders, Medea Benjamin, was wearing pink. She had blonde hair. Was laughing as the demonstrators were calling for the abolition of Israel. The reason I showed this video is because this past February, a city in Bavaria called Bayreuth, where, as many of you know, the Richard Wagner Festival takes place each year, the Ring Cycle in southern Bavaria, awarded this group, Code Pink, a 10,000 euro tolerance prize. I've written about this in the Jerusalem Post extensively, so that the group was awarded a human rights prize for their tolerance work. Once I found out about the award, I contacted the mayor of the city and sent her this video and a lot of detailed reports about Code Pink. And when they attended a conference in Iran in 2014 with Holocaust deniers, that was also presented to her, including a BuzzFeed article about it. She was weighing the information, going back and forth, and asking me to hold off on my Jerusalem Post article, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, as I was about to, I published my article on the same day, or a few hours before, she announced her opposition to the award, based on her city's, or her responsibility to the victims of National Socialism in Germany. It created a national scandal once she set out this press release based on the information I'd sent her. She cited the Jerusalem Post's investigative report, and the city council in this city went ballistic and decided to take a vote on the award. They eventually, after 2 weeks of heated discussions, including a number of members of the German parliament who intervened from the German-Israeli parliamentary group who said, we oppose the tolerance award to Code Pink, the city council in the end voted 23-18 to award a BDS group a 10,000 euro prize, which they will receive, I believe, in a week. So the reason I'm showing this is because this is the reality in Europe. A group that, Code Pink in the United States, that shows up in Congress and disrupts congressional proceedings and claims to respect the First Amendment, but ends up trashing it through their efforts to suppress speech, is part of the mainstream in European society and are awarded tolerance prizes. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because it shows, in this case, what you have is state-sponsored BDS, as opposed to the US, where I've been told, and again, I'm based in Israel and Europe, so I'm somewhat disconnected from what's happening in the United States. I've been told is mainly on college campuses and with academia, and that's what I've read. But in Europe, it's, as I said, it's state-sponsored. In this case, it was a municipality that awarded this group the prize. And it makes sense on some level because for decades, cities, states in Germany, the federal government, they've socialized the climate in Germany to be amenable to these types of groups. Now, a quick overview, this is what I'd like to talk about, and I'll try to keep it short because I'm of the view that good questions are better than good answers, and it's always more interesting. First, just a quick overview of the BDS movement and the labeling of products, since the title of this talk is Europe's Economic War on Israel, the Role of Anti-Semitism in BDS and Product Labels. The second point I'd like to cover quickly is the overview of product labels from 2015 and the resulting actions once the product label measure went into effect. Israel and the US response, as well as the presidential candidates. I think that might be interesting to hear what they have to say about product labels. The damage to Israel's economy, the mixed views about what is BDS, or in this case, and the product labels, what effect has that type of movement had on Israel's economy. And the lack of countervailing forces, that'll mainly cover Europe in contrast to the United States, where there's largely a complete lack of countervailing forces to stymie or blunt the BDS movement. Whereas in the United States, you have, as one of the audience members told me earlier, that the state of New York now is threatening to cut money to the City University of New York system because of anti-Semitism, right? 1/3 of the budget, I was told, might be slashed. The opposite would happen in New York. They would increase the budget to support BDS. And finally, where's BDS tending? Now, in terms of Europe, and I think this is interesting because in Europe in the 60s, after the 67 war, there were certain thinkers who actually predicted where we're going to be now. Both of these thinkers were Jews, both of them, one from Germany and one from Austria. One survived Auschwitz, and his name is Jean Amri. Many folks may have heard him. In the late 60s, he said, open quote, "Anti-Zionism contains anti-Semitism like a cloud contains a storm," close quote. This is a left-wing writer who immediately recognized that anti-Semitism is identical with anti-Zionism. We're now, 48 years later, 49 years later, in New York City, and I read in the New York Times the other day an article from Eric Alterman, professor at Brooklyn College, who writes a column for The Nation, claiming that BDS is not anti-Semitic, or that or Peter Beinart, who just wrote in Haaretz, the same tone, I should say. Peter Beinart's article was clear, saying that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So that's the mainstream view here, I think, among many of these sort of left of center thinkers. One other thinker in Germany, Hans Meyer, who was a literature professor, also from the left, he was some type of cultural Marxist, wrote in a book, his autobiography is called Outsiders in 1982. I'm not sure if it was translated into English, but he wrote, open quote, "Whoever attacks Zionism but by no means intends to say anything against Jews, is deceiving himself or others. The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Whoever wishes to destroy it overtly or by means of policies that can affect nothing but such destruction is pursuing the Jew hatred of years past and beyond. Now it's interesting, these are left-wing thinkers who are equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but it just hasn't been absorbed by Germany in this case, or Austria, or European society in general. But I'll revisit that a little bit later because I wanted to talk about the Israeli embassy's response to that award. The Israeli embassy was just completely outraged, and it issued one of the most powerful statements I've seen in the 10 years, 15 years I've been reporting on Germany. One last quote, and this came from November of this year from Charlotte Knoblauch. She's the head of the Munich Jewish community. It's the second largest Jewish community in Germany, and she's a Holocaust survivor. She's now about 83. She told me when Munich was about to, right before the city of Munich was about to provide a room in its cultural center to a BDS speaker, she turned to me and told me in an email, and I'll quote her, open quote, "The BDS campaign disguises the socially acceptable, don't buy from Jews, as a modernized form of Nazi jargon by demanding don't buy from the Jewish state," close quote. She was outraged because in November, right before the memorial commemoration services for the pogroms in 1938, the city of Munich provided space to a BDS speaker. Again, state-sponsored, in this case city-sponsored BDS. Now, what is BDS? Many of you folks know, and I apologize if I'm repeating what's probably self-evident for most folks in this group. The BDS document from 2005 demands the end of Israel's occupation and colonialization of all Arab lands, dismantling the security wall that protects Israel from Palestinians, and the right of return of several million, actually more than several million right now, descendants of original Arab refugees. The founder, Omar Barghouti, has stated of BDS, the real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel. A return for refugees would end Israel's existence as a Jewish state. Now, that's what the founder is saying BDS is. The product label movement, or it's a movement on some level, is highly dangerous from my perspective. Now, in 2009, Denmark implemented product labels on, again, products from the disputed territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan. So when I talk about the settlements, I'll move back and forth between the disputed territories and the settlements. The UK was in 2009, I apologize. Denmark was in 2013. So Denmark was 2013. The UK was the first country in 2009 to implement product labeling. So it probably corresponds to why they have such a high level of anti-Semitism. It would be an interesting study. Belgium, 2014. So while Belgium was not too focused on terrorist cells in Brussels, they were very focused on labeling Israeli products. But that's a whole story, another story. So the EU started this escalating strategy, starting with Britain in 2009 and moving to some of the other member states, all of which, of course, are in Western Europe, because this is where most of the BDS activity is going on. That, in short, Western Europe is the battleground of BDS, the global battleground, I would say. It's not, I don't mean to poo-poo what's happening in the United States and Canada, because there's some really horrific stuff happening on U.S. campuses. But in terms of, again, state-sponsored BDS, the war zone right now is Western Europe and Central Europe. And I'll go back to where BDS first started in Germany, which I think is very interesting in terms of the labeling. In 2012, the neo-Nazi party in Germany, the NPD, submitted a legislative initiative in the state of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania. It really was in the capital. Schwerin is the capital of this East German state, to label Israeli products. The head of the NPD in the state, his name's Udo Paster, some of you may have read about it. He's declared Germany to be a Jew republic. So that took place in 2012. And you can watch the video, if you know German, online, where they're debating and talking about this initiative to label Israeli products. Again, 2012 in Germany. A year later, the German Green Party, which is an enormously powerful party in Germany, it was part of the German coalition government with the Social Democrats before Chancellor Merkel became chancellor in 2005. So the Greens control right now one state, Baden-Württemberg, where the governor of the state and the party are the Greens. So it's a very powerful party in Germany in contrast to many other countries. They spent enormous amounts of time in the Bundestag, this is on the federal level, where their members of parliament crafted an initiative to label Israeli products. So while tens of thousands of Syrians were getting slaughtered in Syria by Hezbollah, Iran, Putin wasn't directly involved at that point, and the Assad regime, the German MP spent probably months crafting this long, detailed initiative to label Israeli products. Their departure point is when I talk to them, we want consumers to be notified about where their products came from. I, of course, as a journalist, asked them in multiple press queries, why aren't, there are, as hundreds of territorial disputes, why aren't you labeling products from Western Sahara, right, where Morocco currently occupies that region? They couldn't answer. I said, well, why are you so intensely focused on Israel? Well, we want consumers to know where these products are coming from. But what about Tibet? What about North Cyprus? The Turks, of course, are occupying. And they couldn't give me an answer. What I did find interesting is when I asked them if they copied or plagiarized the neo-Nazi legislation, then they went ballistic. They were very upset when I said, well, it's very bizarre because the language is identical. Did you plagiarize them? How did this come about? And they just sort of refused to answer the question and said it was absurd. But it gives you a sense, I think, in the case of Germany, again, this is across Western Europe, where you have the radical right merging with the sort of left liberals, and the only issue where they can unify is how to beat up Israel, how to turn Israel into a human punching bag, how to label products. And that's a reoccurring pattern. There's sort of a Nietzschean notion of the eternal reoccurrence of the same, I've noticed in Europe. When Israel becomes a hot button issue, suddenly the entire spectrum of political parties, from the conservatives to the liberals to the far left, to include the far right, can unify on this one issue. And that's what we've seen in terms of labeling. There's a couple of other examples that I'll delve into where the left or the Social Democrats have pushed labeling. The Social Democratic mayor of the city of Jena in East Germany has supported a full boycott of Israeli products for years. His name is Albrecht Schroeder. He supports, again, a more extreme version and hasn't backed away from his boycott. I'll move into point number 2, the overview of product labels from 2015. So that's the background, at least in Germany. And I'm focused on Germany not only because I'm a reporter there, but because Germany is the economic engine of Europe and considered by the Israeli government to be the best friend of Israel in Europe. Clearly, there seems to be a disconnect right now between those positions where German-Israeli relations are rock solid because of these types of disputes, especially in the area of product labels. 2015, November 11th, the European Union introduced what's called an interpretive notice on indication of origin of goods from the territories occupied in Israel since June 1967. That was the measure it wasn't a legal measure, but it was a measure, I guess, a strong recommendation was how I interpret the language when I read it, for member states, the 28, to label Israeli products. Now, the labels apply, and many of you read this, I'm sorry I'm repeating something you already know, to fresh fruit, vegetables, honey, wine, olive oil, eggs, poultry, organic products, and cosmetics. The Israeli response to this labeling measure was rather fierce, understandably, given that Israel was singled out and that one other territorial dispute has been singled out for labeling. Prime Minister Netanyahu just said at the time, open quote, the EU decided to mark only goods made by Israel and unwilling to accept the fact that EU labels the side being attacked by terror, close quote. Aya Shakad, the Justice Minister, said, open quote, anti-Israel and called the product labels open quote, anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, close quote. Isaac Herzog from Labor, from the Zionist Party, equated this measure with the Zionism is racism resolution that his father dealt with when he was the UN ambassador. Lapid, Yair Lapid, another opposition politician, said, open quote, the EU is capitulating to the worst elements of jihad, close quote. Labeling is, he continued, open quote, a direct continuation of the boycott movement against Israel, which is anti-Semitic and misguided, he said. So Israel's response, and there were many other comments where the Israelis, government officials equated the measure with the German boycott of Jewish businesses in the 30s and what happened in 2015. So the EU's response, and this is the EU ambassador to Israel, Lars Faberg Anderson, he said, open quote, the EU is against the so-called BDS, and we are against any attempts to isolate Israel. Relations with Israel are among the closest the EU has with any non-member state. Israel's trade with the EU has increased from 20 to 30 billion euros per year over the last 10 years. We have signed agreements on liberalizing trade in agriculture and fishery products, on research operations, on air traffic, on pharmaceutical products. Europe is not boycotting Israel. So those are the competing views. Personally, I see, and I've written about this in Haaretz in 2013 after the Green Party introduced this measure in the Bundestag. I subscribe to the theory that the labeling is a slippery slope, and it will lead to an incremental boycott, full boycott of Israel. It's just a matter of time. Because in Europe, once you begin to label products, Jewish products, it turns those products creates a pariah status for those products, just because of the sociology of Europe right now. Europeans, in my view, can't make these types of distinctions. There's all sorts of historical reasons why they want to punish Israel, and it could turn into a de facto boycott. If I may diverge for 1 second, I'm of the view right now, and this is my thesis, that Israel, Europe, and again, I'm focusing mainly on Western Europe, Europeans will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. I'm saying that in a very sarcastic way, but there was a famous Israeli psychoanalyst, Zivi Rex, who said the Germans will never forgive the Israelis, or the Jews, for Auschwitz. I think it's moved beyond that now, and what we're seeing is a pan-European epidemic where Europe will not, as I said, forgive the Israelis for the Shoah. And that's a problem, because a lot of what's motivating, I think, this BDS activity in Europe is this type of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, to use a fancy sociological term from two German philosophers who used to work actually for this organization, AJC, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. So, did you want to ask a question? Yeah. She asked two questions, sorry, thanks for reminding me. What role are European Muslim communities playing in product labels and anti-Semitism? And are they influencing politicians? And the second point she asked is the Obama administration pushing Europe to do its dirty work in terms of these sort of soft BDS measures. Is that correct? Okay. Let me just address the first question, and then I think my comments, which I'm about to segue into in terms of the Obama administration's response to BDS, might answer your question. If not, I'll try to answer it in a follow-up way. I do think Muslim communities, European Muslim communities, whether in France or Germany, which has over 4 million Muslims, many of whom have citizenship, most of whom are German Turks, although there's a large German Arab population, and now with over 1 million new migrants who are potential citizens, there'll be even a larger role. So yes, to answer your question, Muslim voting blocs play a role in many of these countries. Politicians, of course, are in a state of denial. They won't openly express that, but clearly it plays a role. I think it's going to be much more dangerous in Germany now that there's a very large Muslim voting bloc, because I've seen large communities of German Muslims who are well integrated but are participating in anti-Israeli demonstrations that are calling for Israel to be boycotted. You know, politicians in Germany are saying, well, they need to sign a form or make some commitment that they're, you know, the migrants, that they support Israel. There has to be some type of prerequisite as part of democratic life in Germany. It strikes me as rather odd. I mean, I know this is a dangerous parallel, and I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, so I'll qualify this next comment with scary quotes. But in Germany, after the World War II, the Americans implemented denazification, right? And the German soldiers and other Germans who were absorbed or immersed in lethal anti-Semitism had to sign a form, I'm no longer a Nazi. So Germany now goes back to this sort of same process because it's very bureaucratic. They want refugees and migrants to sign a form that I'll support Israel. We know that denazification didn't work that well after 1945. There were still Nazis in the judicial system. There were still German scientists working for Egypt and to help them with their missile system to destroy Israel. So I'm just not a big believer that after years of being socialized in Syria, and B'nai B'rith did a long study on school books in Syria many years ago, those books were filled with lethal anti-Semitism, filled with classical anti-Semitism, filled with the toxic mix of modern and classical anti-Semitism. I don't believe that those young men and women are going to suddenly accept Israel's right to exist and not engage in anti-Semitic activity. So that's why I'm very skeptical. Chancellor Merkel told the head of the Jewish community, Joseph Schuster, in a meeting, the head of the Central Council for Jews in Germany, which has about 105,000 members, he said, well, we're going to have a problem with migrants in terms of safety for the Jewish community and anti-Semitism. And she told him in this sort of cabinet meeting, well, we'll just take care of that. The Western or the American press didn't pick up on it. I reported in the Jerusalem Post. I translated it. And it was just sort of like, you know, the functional equivalent of an employee coming to your office with a grievance and saying, you know, I want to contest this work violation. You'll say, I'll take care of it. But we're talking about a problem involving anti-Semitism. Let me just segue, and then I'll answer your question after I deal with this section on the Obama administration's response to product labels. In late January, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency changed its policy on imports from the West Bank, imposing, in fact, a sanction on goods. So the Obama administration mirrored or absorbed Europe's policy. But at the time, it was interesting. When asked in November if labeling constitutes a boycott, Mark C. Toner, U.S. State Department deputy spokesman, said, open quote, it could be perceived as a step on the way, close quote. He was stumbling a bit, but he acknowledged it could lead to a boycott. Just a month later, his boss, John Kirby, State Department spokesman, said, open quote, we do not view the labeling origin of products as being from the settlements a boycott of Israel. We also do not believe that labeling the origin of products is equivalent to a boycott, closed quote. So that's the Obama administration's position, which mirrors the European Union position right now. But there have been some lawmakers in the U.S. have tried to breathe life and fire into stopping the European labeling system. Here's some examples. Prior to the EU imposing a label on Israeli products in November, Senator from the great state of New York, Kirsten Gillibrand, am I pronouncing that right? Yes. And presidential candidate from the Republican Party, Ted Cruz, took the lead in sending out a letter to the EU in November. They wrote, it was a bipartisan letter, I think 36 senators. I have to check the exact number, but it was a high number of senators. Open quote, as allies, elected representatives of the American people and strong supporters of Israel, we urge you not to implement this labeling policy, which appears intended to discourage Europeans from purchasing these products and promote a de facto boycott of Israel, close quote. So they got it, in my view, the senators who wrote that letter. In terms of the presidential candidates, well, he's now defunct, but Mark Rubio is defunct as a presidential candidate, condemned the guidelines as anti-Semitic. He used the A word. Hillary Clinton has condemned the BDS movement, but to my knowledge has not addressed the labeling guidelines. I don't recall her saying anything at her speech at APEC. Correct me if I'm wrong. Donald Trump has remained silent on the BDS, and labeling. As folks know, his sort of now famous quote is, open quote, "Let me be sort of a neutral guy," close quote, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And what I thought was interesting, in Germany, he had a spokeswoman show up on a very popular television show. They have talk shows which are sort of newsy and a bit different than the U.S., sort of a mixture of news and entertainment. And she went to great lengths to say that Trump would be neutral in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So she was speaking to an audience that wanted to hear that and sending them sort of dog whistles that, from her point of view, Trump will sort of continue Obama's policies or in that direction. That's how I interpret it. Now, what's interesting in terms of the responses from the Americans is there has also been a breath of fresh air in Europe. There are two countries that actually opposed implementing labels. Many of you may have read this in the Jerusalem Post and other Israeli papers. Hungary, with a very right-wing government, authoritarian, I would say, with a small a, or maybe with a large a right now, it's hard to say, and the most left-wing government in the history of Europe since 1945 in Greece. Both of those countries are vehemently opposed to labeling and are not going to label Israeli products. So it's a topsy-turvy world right now in Europe. I'm trying to make sense of it, and a lot of other people are too, in terms of how this labeling is playing out. Okay, the damage to Israel's economy, and I'll just quickly go through this. There's been mixed views on the damage to Israel's economy based on what I've read. Some of the high-profile companies, many of you have read, pulled out of the disputed territories. For example, SodaStream. That's probably the most important, I guess, example of where BDS imposed pressure. I thought it was remarkable when I was abroad that Scarlett Johansson, is that how you pronounce her name? As many of you know, came out against BDS and used the A word too. She talked about there's a lot of anti-Semitism out there, is what she said, which is very interesting because she has understands contemporary anti-Semitism without getting into all the academic theory about it. She instinctively understood it, and so did Woody Allen, by the way, when he was in Israel.
That's amazing.
There was an interview with him when he was doing his new film, and he talked about, during this interview with one of the Israeli television stations, that there's a lot of anti-Semitism behind this sort of ad nauseum criticism of Israel that we experience. I think it was last year, 2 years ago. If you send me an email afterwards, I'll send you the link. So the damage to Israel's economy, as I've mentioned, there is SodaStream, there is the case of the Orange telecommunications giant that claims it wasn't a BDS measure, and the CEO showed up to Israel to try to apologize. But on the other hand, when you look at Israel's economy, Israel's exports to Europe have increased since 2005. They're still fairly strong. Even in South Africa, as one of my editors at the Jerusalem Post recently wrote, trade has increased, even though there's an incredibly hostile environment toward Israel there. And trade is now increasing with China, India, Southeast Asia, Vietnam. So there is this, again, what I would say a mixed bag. Is BDS really hurting Israel's economy? I mean, they're competing views. I should say, when I did interview Uzi Dayan when I was in Israel in February, the former Major General in the Israeli army, the nephew of Moshe Dayan, I asked him about BDS, and he said to me that the main problem with this BDS movement is delegitimization. That these folks who are the BDS activists are trying to strip Israel of its identity, trying to strip Israel, of course, of its existence, and trying to just issue body blows to Israel so that it loses its sense of legitimacy. In short, to turn Israel into a highly abnormal country. So I think his perspective is interesting because that's where a lot of the BDS is taking place, right? Especially in Europe. I mean, I tweet every weekend, or try to tweet every weekend. Another weekend passes in Europe where there hasn't been one mass demonstration against Assad, the Islamic State, Hezbollah, and Iran. And I said, I'll ask on my Twitter feed, where are those tens of thousands of Gaza supporters when you need them? And this has been going on now for 5 years now, right? We just went past the 5-year point for the Syrian civil war. But what immediately triggers mass demonstrations across European cities, Berlin, Paris, London, is a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. There is one thinker who just wrote, one writer in Ynet just a few days ago, Tal Kainan, the CEO of Clarity Capital, a New York and Tel Aviv-based investment firm. He wrote a piece, BDS is an existential threat. And he delved into it, and you can read the article on Ynet, from the economic point of view, and listed some very compelling figures as to why BDS has the potential to severely damage Israel's economy. Now, I'll move on to the countervailing forces. I should just add, in terms of BDS and Israel's economy, I think the jury's still out. That's sort of my view at this point. I think I'm agnostic, but at times I tend to think that it's doing some damage. But in the final analysis, I think the jury's still out in terms of the economy. I think Uzi Dayan, my personal view, was right that these types of movements, unless there's resistance, will continue to create a delegitimization of Israel's existence. This leads me to the countervailing forces in the U.S. versus the European Union. As I mentioned at the outset of this talk, the main difference, as I see it, is you have mini movements across Europe, civil society organizations, NGOs, and of course political leaders and state organizations, state entities that support BDS. Nearly 50 states in the United States have now passed some form of anti-BDS legislation, whether it's real legislation with teeth, which we have in the state of Illinois, which last week listed, named and shamed companies. I have to check the list if some of those countries are European that are involved in BDS activity. That's highly remarkable that a state would do that at this point, and the state of Illinois seeks to penalize companies that engage in BDS activity. New York State, the legislation is still meandering its way through the process. I spoke to someone from the state Senate, the spokesperson, and he explained to me that, as I understand it, the Senate is trying to merge a bill with the Assembly to have a very, very robust anti-BDS law in New York State. But we've seen other states, South Carolina, et cetera. Georgia the other day also passed anti-BDS legislation. This is unprecedented. In Europe, there is one example. It wasn't initially designed for BDS, but France has what's been interpreted now as an anti-BDS law that came about in 2003, excuse me. It's called the Lelouch Law, and it has stiff penalties for BDS. So to France's credit, they have BDS law on the books, but at the same time, the French were the ones who were aggressively pushing product labelings. So we have that sort of cognitive dissonance in the French psyche playing out. And of course, the French want to implement, or moving in the direction of some type of unilateral plan to impose a settlement on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which again could be viewed as a form of BDS in terms of a larger definition. So France is the one example that mirrors the U.S., but it doesn't oppose product labeling, which many of the U.S. measures do. And Britain, many of you may have read that the Tory government, David Cameron's government, passed legislation to punish city councils that want to boycott Israel, which is also quite remarkable, given that many of these city councils are controlled by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, and they've been incredibly energetic in boycotting Israel and passing resolutions. And the Tory government's legislation has teeth to it. So it's something that could be a model for the continent if other countries like Germany and Switzerland, Norway would be willing to move in that direction. Spain, there's a pro-Israel group there that's used the anti-discrimination law in Spain to force a city council to withdraw its boycott resolution. and they forced Ariel University, they forced a Spanish university to pay compensation, or it might have been the Spanish government, to pay Ariel University in the disputed territory compensation for excluding the university from academic competition. The settlement came out last year, I believe. So that's a clever tactic in terms of using anti-discrimination law. But I should say, and I don't mean to, be impose sort of a form of clinical depression on all of you tonight, but I think where most of these groups are just scratching the surface in terms of BDS in Europe. These are very important victories, but BDS, again, I'm using a broad definition, is so ubiquitous in Europe that you need, in my view, to incorporate a strategy where you begin to mobilize groups on the ground, because there is a lot of pro-Israel potential in Europe, Christian Zionists, other groups that are just unorganized and non-mobilized. That's a long-term project, but it can be done. So I do see segments of the European community as being a bundle of potential. So while everyone's beating up Europe, and I'm one to beat up Europe too because of their horrible anti-terrorism policies, the Europeans could regenerate themselves very quickly, not only in terms of counterterrorism, in terms of what we saw in Belgium, what we've seen in France and Denmark. Many Europeans could regenerate themselves in terms of support for Israel once they have a deeper understanding of what this, for lack of a better word, what this war is about right now. So a couple of other examples in Europe where there have been some successes. The banking system in Europe, I just broke a story for the Jerusalem Post in February. The DAB bank in Munich holds a BDS account for the main BDS group in Germany called BDS Campaign. So I was meandering my way through their website. I noticed that the BDS group lists the bank account, and you can electronically transfer funds to this group. So I found out that the bank was owned by Paribus in France, which was just fined nearly $9 billion by the US government for Iran, Cuba, and Sudan sanctions, I think a year ago. It's the largest fine for a financial institution in the history of banking. And this bank in France owns the German bank, and I contacted the spokesperson, and I said, asked him questions. Is this a violation of French law? There's an anti-BDS law. How does this mesh with your anti-terrorism policies in light of the fine? Because a lot of these BDS groups, if you closely monitor them, like what we did with Code Pink, they're working with jihadists, they're working with Hamas, they're working with Hezbollah. So it's much more interconnected in Europe. It's worth recalling that Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization, is legal in Europe. They outlawed the military wing, which is a distinction without a difference, but the organization, the political wing, is still operating. So this organization, and they, of course, Hezbollah and the Hamas members, which is also illegal, but there are 300 members in Germany, participate in this BDS activity. So to cut to the chase, the French bank, Paribus, within a week, closed the account of the BDS group. So it's interesting that there is some sensitivity. I was, to my astonishment, this took place within a week when I spoke to a second source to confirm it, and the BDS campaign group in Germany went ballistic, and they were issuing all sorts of anti-Semitic cartoons about the closure, attacking me in terms of with these cartoons and articles. But a large financial institution in Germany and France recognized that there's something very unsavory about BDS and closed the account. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes in terms of the countervailing forces in Europe. There are other organizations that are doing terrific work in uncovering BDS activity, exposing the inherently anti-Semitic nature of these organizations. NGO Monitor, many of you probably know, Professor Gerald Steinberg. They've delved into this whole layer of NGOs, and I see it as a sort of a troika system. You have the state-sponsored BDS apparatus, that's the government. You have NGOs which are scattered all around, which receive government funding that promote BDS in Israel and, of course, in Europe. And then the third layer is the civil society or private organizations that are actively involved in BDS. Also in Austria, there has been, again, to my astonishment, the Austrians are actually far ahead of the Germans in countering BDS. In my wildest dreams, I never thought this would have happened, but this past March, for those who follow BDS on campuses in Europe, a student group at the University of Vienna, three groups that form the governing coalition in the student parliament: the Social Democrats, because the student groups they're very aligned with political parties. You know, it's much different than U.S. The Social Democrats, which the Chancellor of Austria is a Social Democrat, the Greens, another very powerful party in Austria, and the Communists. Yes, there are some communists left, but this is probably the only pro-Israel communist group I've met. And these three student groups that control the student parliament issued a resolution defining BDS as anti-Semitic and opposing it, of course, and criticizing their U.S. counterparts on colleges for supporting BDS. I wrote the dispatch for the Jerusalem Post, did very well. I strongly suspect it was a bit over 100,000 page views, but it didn't get as much traction in the U.S. as I anticipated, probably because it's an election cycle and everyone sort of turned inward and focused more on what's happening in the U.S. But it's just inexplicable that one student from the University of Maryland, Nat knows her, mentioned to me that she had read the article and she's doing work in this area and didn't know it was my byline, but she was very happy to see it. It sort of was the type of news that can breed inspiration for folks who are doing work in this area, because it can be very lonely, especially on college campuses right now, I would imagine, for minority groups that are working to oppose BDS. So in Austria, that took place, and the mayor of Austria told me also in February, his spokesman called me, and I was inquiring about BDS events in a city-subsidized building. He told me he opposes BDS. The mayor of Vienna is a social democrat, and following the expose in the Jerusalem Post, the city of Vienna pulled the plug on the three BDS events in a city-subsidized cultural center. There was also additional pressure in the city of Vienna, but it's very interesting that there is a strong anti-BDS current in Vienna. And lastly, many of you might know this woman, Hedy Epstein, who's a anti-Zionist Jew and has very favorable views of Hamas. She's 91 and she travels around the world, mainly Europe, bashing Israel and calling for the dissolution of Israel. She was scheduled to speak in the Austrian parliament. She's based in St. Louis. As you can imagine, she's an enormously popular speaker in Europe. There's an incredible demand for someone because she survived the Holocaust. She fled Nazi Germany in 1938. Wait, when was the Kindertransport? 38, 39? 39, thank you. To Great Britain. One could argue about what's the definition of a Holocaust survivor. That's a whole nother discussion. But she, her website and her spiel is Holocaust survivor Hedy Epstein will deliver a talk against Israel. But what I think is remarkable is that the Austrian Parliament was slated to hold a talk with her, and it was during International Women's Day, during that week where events were being held to honor women. And they invited women from around the world to talk about genocidal events. So Japanese women who survived or witnessed Hiroshima, Nagasaki, etc. And Hedy was scheduled to speak, but she typically talks about Israel in her talks. And the woman who organized the event is a 9/11 truther from the United States who believes in her articles that in one article she wrote that Israel was behind 9/11. So I presented this information to the spokeswoman for the Austrian Parliament, and the Austrian parliamentary president, canceled the event. So there is something at work in Austria. I don't know if it's going to spill over into other countries, where there is some level of it's not perfect, but there seems to be a level of sensitivity about this issue that I don't see right now in Germany or Switzerland. Now I will get to the last point here. Let me just see how we're doing. Yes, so we can ask questions. Point number 6, where's BDS in Europe tending. I'll just give a running shopping list of where I see BDS tending, the dangers ahead. These are the areas that I would imagine, Israeli officials and these, the NGOs are involved in fighting BDS, and European politicians who are sympathetic to Israel would have to devote serious thought to, in my view. Settlers or Israelis who live in the settlements being banned from entering the EU, that's a potential danger. That could be the next step in terms of where BDS is tending in Europe. What we saw last week at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, where there was a blacklist of Israeli, the council introduced a blacklist of firms operating in the disputed territories to cause damage. That could be absorbed or taken on by the EU, because the EU countries, I think most of them abstained from the vote. So typical European Union, where their spines quickly turn to jelly when they have to make an important decision. 3, the incremental labeling of more products from the disputed territories, stronger labeling, intensified activity in this area, increased BDS activity from, as I mentioned, new migrants to Europe. That will give a shot in the arm to the BDS activists, again, in the next generation or the current generation. Depends how fast folks get integrated. I'm joking here, but a perfect integration would mean in Europe that they support BDS. If you're well integrated and well assimilated, that would correspond to supporting BDS. The possible interference with more human rights groups. For example, Human Rights Watch just called for a boycott of Israeli goods in the disputed territories. So more activity in that area. I also see more attempts, for example, in Bremen and Bonn, after the labeling took place, which I mentioned gave a real shot in the arm to BDS activists. A groups of Germans marched into department stores and supermarkets wearing white coats, and on the white coats there was the word inspector, and they went around seizing Israeli goods to inspect them if they were from the disputed territories. The white coats, of course, suggest that Israeli products are contaminated. So it's a the continuity between the 12 years of fascism between 1933 and 1945 and the present was on display with these German groups, these anti-Israeli activists, and these were Germans. I've watched the videos and I've read the articles who marched into these department stores. And as many of you know, and I'll end on this point, there was a high-end department store that pooled Israeli wines from their shelves, KaDeWe in Berlin, earlier this year. It was a big story because the Spiegel reporter, whom I know, called up the department store and sent emails. I got copies of his email queries from different sources, and he said, "What Israeli products are on your shelves? The EU just passed a law determining them to be illegal." And of course, KaDeWe, there was a Pavlovian reaction, and they removed 8 brands of wines from the store in January. So I spoke to the spokesman, and when I was in Israel, and he was trying to defend it, saying, "Well, we want to make sure it's properly labeled, etc." And then I researched the department store a bit more, and the department store was Aryanized in the 1930s. And I published that, and then the Israeli government, I noticed the next day, picked up on that because they quoted it in their statements that the store was Aryanized, and the store quickly put back the products. When I spoke to the Spiegel reporter, and I asked him, "Well, you sent this email saying that the products are illegal," and he was tweeting about it, that this is illegal. And in Europe, it's opinion journalism and news gathering is mixed. It's much different than the United States and England, where there's a Berlin Wall between editorializing and straight news reporting or news gathering. And I asked him, "Well, what was your motivation for this, and did you consult with your editors?" And he said yes. And then he told me that all the editors at Der Spiegel support labeling. I said, "There must be one dissenting voice there," and he declined to answer my last question. I'll end on that note. Thanks for your time.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.